All right. Let's go to the next topic, the police laws. I would say, from what I've read so far, soon your nose is not fitting for me. You should go to jail. We had this time, I remember it. When I was young, there was this wall that came down, and it kind of looked like that behind that wall. I don't know if I want to go back to that. That's why I'm super excited why Marie Brackling and Constanze Kurz, both journalists from netzpolitik.org, are going to talk about the police laws of Germany to you tonight. Big round of applause for the two of them. Well, thank you, Mirko. We're thinking if we should switch to French and do this in French, but I think we're going to continue in German. We are happy and are looking forward, and we're super interested in all of you showing up. And most of you that are German who are sitting here are affected. We would like to talk what is in these police laws, what are the most debated ones and the most questionable things that are going to be implemented. We want to talk about the protests and the way that it's supposed to be for a proper talk on this. We have a few demands at the end that hopefully overlap with your wishes after the talk, and hopefully we'll find some common grounds. We do find the development quite concerning that we saw over the past year. And why do we want to talk about this? There was a few things. We had a few points of touch with this. We wrote about these things. You can read those articles on netzpolitik.org. That's not just the two of us, but also other members from the editorial staff. We were invited as experts in different German counties. There was different teams of the CCC that sent out written expert statements. And we want to talk a little bit about how the process of that is as well. That was important to us. We want to start now with the question of protests. We would like to start with the positive and then move forward to the more and more mean measurements. I think we had a bit of luck this year because in Bavaria, as we know, there was a county election that led to protests being a little bit more widespread. As you can see, we were quite surprised how many protesters actually showed up for the demonstration, and that the politicians reacting to all these protesters and this massive protesters showing up, they had to react. This is obviously not the first police law in the federal state of Hesse. There was already one before, but the protests that were recognized beyond the county state, not just in Bavaria, and they were quite big, and I do think that the county election, like the electoral vote was definitely helped. And there was obviously different posters that were quite amusing. So the protest was quite big. It was quite the largest protest Bavaria had seen in years. There was one day in Munich where 40,000 people took it to the street. That's in Berlin dimensions, but in Bavaria, these are quite unheard of. And I would like to say, we had a few allies that were quite surprising. I mean, it wasn't just a big protest, it was a quite diverse protest. That was very mentionable within Bavaria. It was all parties except for the CSU. It was unions that took part in this. Even the police unions let out critical statements, which is quite uncommon. Especially Jörg Radek, who is part of the head of the police union. That was quite surprising. And there was other protesters that joined down the line that were quite foreign and strange to me. Like, I have very little to do with the football scene and the soccer scene. There was like very well organized soccer clubs that joined the protest also on the street, not just in the stadium. Especially in Hanover and Lower Saxony, I was quite surprised by they had like the same shirts. They could sing quite well. The only maybe disadvantage was only males, but it actually proved to be quite striking, and they were quite vocal. And I mean, obviously, they're quite affected. She made a word game on the word of punchline that I couldn't really translate into English on the spot. The beautiful thing was that all of this was so positive and like so peaceful, and everybody was kind of waiting for an escalation to take place. So let's go back to Bavaria, because I'd like to go back to how politicians reacted to these large protests taking place. And we have an original representatives, Joachim Herrmann, the Minister of the Interior in Bavaria, that explained to us in the past, I mean, maybe the title of the slide is quite telling, why people are taking it to the streets. Lügenpropaganda is lie propaganda, and it's, yeah. I'm gonna try this again. Can we hear anything? I have the voice on. It should be working. I'm trying to turn up the volume. No, it's just an idea. It's just a thought. It's not working. I'm gonna try to do this. All right. But you can see there's like a thing. Still no sound from stage. Could I get a little hint? Because we tested this, and the plug for the audio is plugged in. And again? I don't know if it's running. I have another idea. I'm just going to try it here. There's now a bunch of yelled advice from the audience. The technician is informed. Help is coming.
Also, just the title of the slide is one of those famous German compound nouns that is very notoriously difficult to translate.
In the evening, we only do this as an extra entertainment aspect to us presenting at this point of the night. Okay, we're going to go back so that you can hear what the important minister, the Minister of Good morning. And were you surprised how many people took to the streets against your law? Oh, yes, of course. It was quite an impressive number, and it was more than were expected to show up, and you have to take this seriously. But I am beyond all baffled that they kind of jumped on this bandwagon of lie propaganda and were led astray. Well, what we can see, obviously, the reasons for the protests were the lie propaganda. And I mean, we have to add here that on netzpolitik.org, we actually reported on this, and it was quite upset by what he said in that interview. And I actually wrote 2 debunk articles about what he said in the interview, but he never got back to me on that. I mean, most of you know the final results in Bavaria. Before the elections, you didn't have to come to consensus with the coalition. So Marie found a really good title, that the police law in Bavaria is, in this extent, is not seen since 1945, basically, the change in the law and this kind of widening of the law. And like in any other county in Germany, that was not to this extent. I would want to talk about now what are the most, and especially judiciary, like measurements, and the most extensive ones. We don't want to talk about everything. We want to talk the ones that are being disputed right now. And I mean, the central point, and everybody's read about this, is the person, the endangerer. So as a non-lawyer and a non-judiciary person, you can leave this aside kind of, but you have to look at the thought and the idea that's behind this, the idea of the endangerer, that we have people that themselves haven't done anything yet. They haven't committed any crime. They're not even shortly before the actual crime. But I have a person where I have two assumptions. One, that they want to do and commit a crime, and that they're capable of doing and committing this crime. And the when and where of this actual crime is completely unknown to me. And this person I would like to I have like this so that there's measurements that I can apply to them now. So because I have a suspicion, there is things such as surveillance, finding out more about this person, and Bavaria was the very first county to do so, to take measurements that are actually quite invasive. Things such as electronic anchor bracelets. It's basically like continuously locating somebody's and having all times like localizing device. I mean, at this point, I don't even know what that person is going to do and where they're going to do it. And now they're continuously controlling somebody's location. And there's a lot of lawyers who actually said, well, how am I supposed to help prevent something if I don't even know where something's going to happen? Like, how are you going to justify taking somebody into custody, for example? I think there's two things that we have to distinguish, like in this case, the sense of this ankle bracelet, this electronic monitoring. Like, for example, if you're let out of jail early and you're an early release, that's completely different. This is potential endangerers, like potential threats. And the case, like the judiciary case that we have in this context, like our common sense, like what's coming and facing us now is what's threatening is a threat that hasn't even materialized yet. So you have to separate these two things. And when it comes to electronic ankle monitoring, we were writing about all sorts of experts that were releasing statements, and we're looking at these cases. There's cases where there was actual attacks, and there was attacks by people who were wearing these ankle bracelets. So actually the practicality of this practice is something that you have to really question. And I mean, obviously there was also technical problems that they did. They don't even have proper laws on how this data is protected. Like this data that's collected, how is that actually securely stored? So there was a lot of stuff that was done wrong on a technical level of this. Like the fact that somebody who is not materializing to be an actual threat, but you're tracking and localizing them constantly is quite disturbing. We brought a few examples. We want to refer to things that we've said in the past. Like you can publicly find these available either on CCC or at netzpolitik.org. Most committees of the interior are usually quoting experts, and there's statements that basically refer back to constitutional law. We always have to remember that we're not talking about people who actually made themselves conspicuous of committing a crime. We're not talking about people who are an actual threat. That have to be stopped in the act of committing a crime. Yet these people are being robbed from their freedom for quite some time. So people who are basically labeled as a potential threat, like we're kind of moving in this thing called preventive custody. That means that somebody who's committed nothing close to a crime but could potentially in the future be willing to commit a crime and is capable of doing so, we can take them into custody. And like this is the most drastic measurement that a state has. And to this day, this was something that was usually between 2 to 4 days in most counties. But it was in a very long period of time. And now when we're talking about the novelization of the new police laws, we're talking 2 weeks, 4 weeks in Bavaria, even 3 months. These are completely new dimensions. Like a little anecdote maybe from Northern Westphalia. I was an expert on a committee there where the CDU and the SPD were having a debate on whether or not that person should be allowed to have a lawyer if you're put into custody for a month. And the SPD was definitely demanding that for somebody being put in that position. But the counter argument in this case, maybe plausible, was, but why? Why would that be necessary? Why would it be necessary to give them a lawyer? We're not actually accusing them of any crime. So there's two things that we can maybe also say beforehand. The police law in Northern Westphalia, they allow for a lawyer to be consulted, and that actually got instated in the mid-December. And the SPD in the opposition in that country actually took this as something to be like their shiny little star, that they pushed for that to be put into the law, which is kind of a common right you should be having. There is, in the beginning, there was some things that we want to talk about, also about patterns of police law, like within the coalition treaty contract, like from the current German government, from the Black-Red coalition, this pattern sample or model police law, there's a lot of differences. So within the coalition contract, there's apparently different zones of police law. And that's something that you can read up on, but it's always claimed. We say we have different zones of right and law. I can quote from the coalition contract. We do not want different zones of different levels of security, and this is why we need to aim for a model of the police law. And if you look at it more closely, and then you look at the aspect that's more preventive, just lock somebody up like that, those are kind of the most significant differences on the different county levels. But we want to talk about this a bit further. There's another thought that we have also from Northern Westphalia, from Jörg Enuschat, who was in the first hearing of the Interior Committee, and he introduces an interesting thought. There's a lot of interesting thoughts from experts in these committees, actually. on how to do this better and how to execute this better. So Jörg Ennerstedt says, what happens if afterwards it is proven that this person was not even a potential threat based on rights of reimbursement, and how you could this could be something that you could use as preventive measurements from taking people into custody too easily and too lightly. So if you take somebody into custody, so compensation. So basically introduce better measurements of compensation for when you throw somebody into this kind of custody without actual having grounds for them being a potential threat. So it's obviously a surprise to no one that there's another measurement that is newly added to the law. There's different forms of the state's Trojan horse, which we captured in the wild in this image. I don't really want to talk about this too extensively because I think the CCC is working on this for the past 10 years. There's two actual verdicts on this from Karlsruhe. And in this discussion, in the center, in the statements of the CCC, you can find this all the time, the changed situation of the IT security and the IT crisis of trust that we're having right now. And I mean, this is obviously something that is mainly due to the Snowden years. So the commercial state Trojans are obviously actually blackmailing and extorting the government. And I also would like to remind of the legislative period before this one. The state Trojan horse was something that was written into the criminal procedural code. So we have something that was, there's constitutional complaints that were filed, 4 of them for this. And there's 4 counties now that obviously are not paying attention to any of this, and it's kind of like this discussion never happened. And there's scenes that happened in Northern Westphalia and Lower Saxony, through the 2 of us, and you have politicians in these county parliaments, and they've never heard of this debate. And their debate is literally fed by American television shows. And I mean, like I have to tell this one story, this one scene, and it's just quite telling of the level of knowledge. And it's a scene with Doris Schröder-Kopf. She's part of the SPD party in Lower Saxony, and she was making suggestions that were, I was making suggestions that were new because I wanted to see the reaction of parliamentarians. So I was trying to introduce, I was saying that maybe some machines should be excluded from this state Trojan horse. Maybe like medical machines should be saved and excluded. And on a judiciary level, you should be thinking about how in a law you could shape this and form this. How can you prevent health and life being threatened from this? And I kind of talked about WannaCry. And I mean, obviously there was quite a few hospitals that were affected by this, and there was no limitations on what a system is. And then Doris Schröder-Kopf looked at me and she said, well, yes, Frau Kurz, Mrs. Kurz, well, what are we going to do? Well, if we do this, then the criminals can take exactly these machines. Well, think about what you just said, like what she just said there. Her thought process is with the state Trojan horse, you can hack all machines. It's kind of like a cheap movie from Hollywood. Like she has no idea what can German governments and government offices actually hack and do, and like the idea that they can hack everything. And if we limit this from a law level, that would also be the technical limitation. And I was telling her about like different operating systems and for what, so for what operating systems this Trojan horse was supposed to be hacking for. So what's in the official description of the people who are then writing the code base for this, and I mean, and also what these governmental institutions can pay for, basically. And I mean, like in the heads of the people of the deciders. I mean, I'm not talking about this one politician. I'm talking about the concept and like the politicians. And like their idea of this and their understanding of this and the limitations of these. Like for 10 years, we've been talking what hacking is in a state context. And then we get to this stage and you think that it's like black magic. And I mean, you guys know. All right. So I think we should leave the state Trojan horse aside because there's lots to talk about this, but we don't really want to do it right now. We've tried to kind of limit the points of argument here, and there were none. I mean, maybe we should at this point mention. Yeah, no, we don't have time. We have to go to the next aspect. We have other technical measurements that are quite disputed. For example, the general video surveillance. We can't really do it in the classic sense anymore. We have to talk about it in the sense where we have a biometric measurement aspect to this. I mean, this is something that they don't really ever distinguish. They blend the two together, which are qualitatively quite different. But I mean, we had a bit of help. I mean, video surveillance per se is something that's researched quite well, and especially in Lower Saxony, there was results from these studies that were showing that the argumentative line for video surveillance. But I mean, honestly, without actually having 2 degrees, I can know and come to the conclusion that a camera is not going to jump between a perpetrator and its victim. I think a lot of experts that empirically research this were usually talking about what video surveillance actually does. And so that was not really our focal point, but what became very clear, and what became very clear to me is that in this discussion that with all these police laws, they call it intelligent video surveillance. What they mean is anomaly detection or biological, biometrical measurement and detection. I mean, this is obviously an aspect that we have to watch out for. There's a little point in brackets here. Generally, all of this is always done under the protection against terrorism. So there's a couple of opposition party members who actually also... this was right after the attack in Strasbourg with weapons, and so the Herbert Reul is the Minister of the Interior, and he stands up and he's like, "You're not really allowed to say this," but he directly links the passing of this law to this attack, and then I mean, like, then he jumps to pedophiles, stalkers, and all sorts of other criminals. And I mean, this is usually the point of arguments that are used to push these laws through. And I mean, like, our point was usually always that the argumentative line was always the current state of threat that we're living in. And to be honest, if we're looking at this, this is not something that can be proven out of facts and reality. Continuously, all the German federal countries are passing new police laws, and there was within the Constitutional Court there was a change in the law, and that affected all the different police laws. And so I mean, there's no proof in the circumstances of threat and the level of threat that's risen, or that there's more of it now. in the current time. And I mean, like the usual claim is that these terroristic attacks could be prevented if only our police laws were a bit more strict and were capable to be more elaborate in what they can do and who they can surveil. Okay, we're going to try to play another audio here. Bear with us. Let's see. I'm going to try this again. Matthias Becker is also a student of law. I do believe that the area that we have, so that a lot of actions that are done before the actual terroristic attack, we have quite extensive laws. So we should maybe critically evaluate our current actions based on the current laws that we have in place, and we should maybe look at and evaluate how they're being put in place before introducing new ones.
So it's not quite clear to me how many of you remember this was in June, but that's also when the first aspects of the parliamentary inquiries into Anis Amri and his attack on the Berlin Christmas market 2 years ago. All of these things were coming out around the same time, and it was very clear at the time that the police actually would have had the ability and the right to look into a lot of these things, but they simply didn't use these insights, and they didn't actually use the rights that they had to capture an actual endangerer, quote unquote, despite all these undercover cops being around him. So you can't just give all these agencies more rights, right? Because with the existing rights that they have, they could have already prevented that. But I think we should make very clear that we also haven't heard from anyone except for current policemen. We haven't found a single lawyer or constitutional lawyer who actually thought that this was a good idea. And I think this is something that you can also look into and that you can research yourself. I also don't think there was a single federal state parliament where they actually had proper empirics for the state Trojan. How many devices are we talking about here? How often can you actually not access data? So if they put facts on the table, that would be very helpful, but it just didn't happen at all, basically. If you look at the way they essentially justified expanding police rights. So, but now let's go to medias res. We have a visual presentation for you, so you can get an overview of what this looks like. And so you can also understand what it looks like in your own federal state. So we want to explain some of these differences between the federal states, even if not all of them. So the lighter ones, so white yellowish ones, are the federal states, which you all know from geography lessons anyway, which have new police laws, either as a draft law or have already decided on those. We have two city-states, Bremen and Berlin, because both of those states, in Bremen, they had a police law draft, but there was a political fight about it, but then it was withdrawn, so the police law wasn't changed. So this was also partially due to successful protests as well. And you can imagine the parties in Bremen present that in slightly different ways, but oh well. And yeah, in Berlin, this is crossed out. Well, Berlin, so far there is no official public draft and we don't know what's in there yet, but there have been some public statements from the government which basically said in a straightforward way that Berlin wants to be a model state. It wants to create the first liberal police law, and they have grand plans, and we're very curious to see what happens there. As Berlin is, as you know, red-red-green, has a red-red-green government, and the only other red-red-green federal state, Thuringia, which for some reason is not on here, but it's the only other federal state that has openly said that it's not going to rewrite its police law, and it's not interested in including new measures and rights for new measures in its law. So this is not chronologically what we're doing here, but we just want to emphasize some of these differences between the different federal states, and also kind of go back to what the state of affairs is right now. So we already discussed North Rhine-Westphalia, So this law was decided on and voted through on December 12th with the support of the SPD, the German Social Democrats, with an interesting justification. So the Social Democrats said that, oh, we've been part of the government for decades now, and now these conservatives are in here with now, but we consider ourselves stately politicians. So for 5 decades, we've been writing police law here, so now we're also going to be part of this. So they're basically saying that at least they're being part of the process. The AfD, the German far-right party, didn't vote and abstained from voting. And the entire debate about this, the AfD literally just talked about refugees. Their justification was, if you don't have refugees, then you don't have criminals. So, well, you don't have crime. One other thing, North Rhine-Westphalia received a lot of praise for having 2 hearings about this, which was very unusual, because usually you have a draft from government, then you have 1 hearing with experts, and then you vote on it, or you basically usually vote it through in parliament, maybe with slight amendments. But North Rhine-Westphalia actually received so much criticism. People really completely ripped this apart, that they really didn't dare to push it through, and that they had another hearing after making several changes. That was really interesting. And I also checked, because this is really important to me. So I was in one of these hearings, and I was invited to the second hearing. There were 10 people in total, and 4 of those were policemen. So that means there were 5 lawyers, myself, and 4 policemen. And imagine that, because when I tell people about this, I really think it's amazing in some way. It's as if they're basically union representatives, as if you were talking about a new hospital law and you had 4 members of a nurses union who are talking to you. But that doesn't happen in any other area where the people who were affected by a law are involved in such an active way, and also are involved in such a disproportionate way. In Lower Saxony, it was actually slightly worse, but we were in hearings on different days, and it was 50-50. So basically there were 3 days with experts, and half of these experts were active policemen of different parts of the state. And of course they have an interest in getting more rights and in expanding the number of things that they can do legally. But just the sheer number that they turned up in is somewhat strange. And also, let's not forget that that's also a black and yellow coalition in North Rhine-Westphalia currently. Of course, the liberals, the German Liberal Democrats, also try to influence this somewhat. And through the changes that were, they really bragged about these changes that were ultimately made to this law before it was actually voted through in North Rhine-Westphalia. Okay, so we're going to move. Did we forget anything? Yes, we forgot something. In North Rhine-Westphalia, some of you may have heard about this, and there was this Hambacher Forst anomaly. So this is a very German thing. You can Google it. We don't have enough time to explain it, I'm afraid. Remember this, because we actually have a video clip later about this. But remember that these activists in this forest who wanted to protect this forest had acid on their fingernails, or had put acid on their fingers. That's something that's going to be very important later on. But because you need to do something about that, because you need to do something not only against extremists but also against activists. So Lower Saxony. So Lower Saxony had hearings. The law has not been decided on yet because something very interesting happened. The Lower Saxonian Parliament has something like a scientific service. So there are several lawyers who are essentially employed by Parliament to give advice to parliamentarians. And so they've looked at what the specific committee for issues of the interior, and they were asked to turn that into a law, and their reaction was basically, oh my God, and they basically said it. They published a very notable document which is publicly accessible, where they basically took this apart bit by bit. And I think one of the things that I said earlier about this electronic ankle bracelets is something that they said, where they were saying, it is absolutely not comprehensible for us what you want to which goal you're trying to achieve with these bracelets if you have barely, not even an inkling what's going to happen there. We didn't know about this concept before, but we didn't encounter this in any other federal state parliament. So this scientific service is considered very proper and is very well respected. But in this case, at least they're holding up the parliamentary process, and there definitely were parliamentarians that were not very happy about this. Thanks. We just want to mention Rainer Wendt, who was invited as an expert in one of these hearings on the same day as you. So obviously they're not embarrassed by anything anymore. And again, German, you can Google him. He's part of a police union and he's said some really stupid things in the past. So, Baden-Württemberg. They, in December 2017, they actually changed some things about their police law, and they wrote some things in there, including the state Trojan, the ankle bracelets, and now they have a new draft law, but we don't yet know how far that's going to go. But we think that the discussion has changed quite a bit because of these debates and the protests and because of these hearings, so we'll see. So, Hessen. You can say something about that. Well, Hessen. I think that was the first case where there was an actual debate, because Hessen is an anomaly, which is why the CCC was very much involved in this. And we have a dedicated website we used to try to help the people who were working against it. So what they were trying to do is they were trying to give the state Trojan to a secret service. But now they've definitely included significant new rights for police and secret services in their new police law, which was voted through in June 2018. And there are several statements by experts and also by CCC, which you can read on our website. All of these were very, very critical, but nevertheless, they voted this law through, but without the Trojan for secret services. Then we have this black state. So, well, now it's not black, it's black now. Since Bavaria voted, they have a coalition now. But in May 2018, when they pushed this through, it was an absolute majority by the CSU, the Christian Conservative Party. Even though we're running low on time, there are two things I think that are important about Bavaria here, because they were special in several ways. I think one thing is the preventative custody, which really is way beyond anything that anyone else wanted to do. Because in Bavaria, they said 2 weeks, 4 weeks, that isn't enough. If we think someone is dangerous and we don't even know what we're accusing them of, we should just put them in custody forever. So they have this endless custody, which they created, which means you can hold someone for 3 months if you just suspect them of something, and then you can extend it for 3 months several times. Of course, every time a judge needs to look at it, but there's no maximum duration of this preventive custody included in the law. So we're waiting for the first case of endless custody. And the second case, I think, this is also, Bavaria. So they expanded DNA analysis. You may have heard that Bavaria is the only state so far that has introduced this idea that if you find DNA traces, you want to look into those and you want to investigate those. So they want to use those to draw conclusions about the skin color of that person and about the geographic origin, biogeographic origin of that person. This led to a lot of protests. This is a very good website, which I would highly recommend, by scientists in Freiburg who are geneticists and biologists, which is called wiedna.de, where they collected a lot of information about this topic and scientifically well-founded materials. So yeah, that's so much worse than this debate about the state Trojan. So this website is very scientific, but it's very readable. So if you want to learn something about this in DNA analysis, then I would highly recommend that as well. Okay, next there's Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. They don't have a state Trojan as part of their law, but at least they have the electronic ankle bracelet and an ability to essentially prevent people from being in the state legally. And they have had all of that since April 2018, and we're expecting further additions. Brandenburg, which is a red government, so Social Democrats and the left. So they have a law. They're going to have the first hearing in 1 week, so in early January 2019. But there are already really strong protests. So this is probably going to be voted on in spring. And it's supposed to include a state Trojan, but, well, not yet. And then there's Saxony. You may have already seen there are lots of signs for one of the demonstrations. Of course, again, there's a group of initiatives that's working on this and working against this. This has been voted through without the Trojan, but it has... so the government has voted it through, but the parliament hasn't voted it through yet. But it also includes significantly expanded rights for secret services and the police. But if you want to have a look at the what this group is doing here in Saxony, then you can have a look at all these posters that are around here. And now we have what we promised you. We brought you an example. We already mentioned this earlier. Oh, we wanted to mention one more thing. We mentioned the expansion of basically criminal law in Germany, and in one way, these revisions of police laws are a response to this expansion of criminal law on the national level. So maybe not in its essence, but generally in its details. And they were not even waiting for what the Constitutional Court might decide in these questions. And now we have this very sympathetic Minister of the Interior of North Rhine-Westphalia. And let's remember what we said in the beginning. The thing that's usually argued is that we have high rates of crime and that we have international terrorism as a threat. And that's why we need these laws, these very drastic, really, intrusions into people's basic rights. And this is the day when North Rhine-Westphalia voted on this law and decided on it. And this is the commentary from their Minister of the Interior. And actually that parliament does look like that. We weren't quite sure, but yeah, that's what that looks like. So let's try picture and audio. So surveilling telecommunications and messengers such as WhatsApp, that's really important. For example, we do this to determine people's identity because 12 hours are not enough if someone has essentially used acid to get rid of their fingerprints. So we can't just let someone go because we can't determine who someone is. That's not a rule of law, what's happening right now. So that's something that should make everyone feel insecure. Anyone who's somewhat sensible should know that there are hundreds of people who are checked, and for half of them you can't even tell who they are because you just don't have the time. That's impossible. It's impossible. It's impossible to determine the identity of 500 people in 12 hours because they just refuse to, and then you have to let them go. But it just doesn't make any sense. If someone... So just to clarify, this is not the evil state. If someone is arrested, that is absolutely up to you. So if that person names their name and their address, they're immediately free, right? So obviously that's not what's written in the law, but just so you have an idea of the level of the quality of the debate that's happening in these parliaments. I was shocked, really. So 2 weeks before that, I was in one of those hearings in that very parliament, and I said that I was very concerned that if you include these measures once, that they will be used for other types of people later on. And all parties were like, no, all of this is rule of law. And then Herbert Reul is coming in 2 weeks later and he says he wants to use this for everyone, for pedophiles, hooligans, activists. Well, this is about these environmental activists that we mentioned earlier. There's a second example here that was less than a week later. So the same Minister of the Interior let someone take a picture and a video of him with this new terror vehicle. So we couldn't keep ourselves from from including this nice comment because someone someone asked on Twitter whether it also had nice embroideries on the seats. Someone who doesn't understand that. So there was a scandal in Saxony where police vehicles had basically right-wing embroideries on parts of their seats. And so then here's also Herbert Reul again. So he was also asked whether he expected that there might be constitutional complaints. And so let's listen to what he said. So might you be worried that someone might sue you in front of the Constitutional Court with this law? Well, of course, with these laws, someone is always going to sue. And that's why it's also smart to write this law in a way that you have the best possible conditions with the constitutional judge. That you have the best possible conditions. So someone always sues. And then as if it was completely normal for you to implement unconstitutional laws. That's an interesting way of presenting the facts and of seeing the world. I've said this often in the previous 10 years, whenever I discuss, ever since I have been discussing these state Trojan things with politicians, and they often say that I've often been telling them the first person who breached the Constitution was the Parliament in these cases. And if they didn't constantly implement unconstitutional laws, they wouldn't have problems with the Constitutional Court all the time. I'm so upset again, and we have 3 minutes left. But now we're coming to our core demands, hoping that you're all going to join us in these demands and are going to shout them loudly at the next demonstrations. So considering that they're not very concise, we'll stick to this, and I think we have the better arguments. We have even more better arguments, just because they are called technical devices. Does that not mean that we are now suddenly agreeing to state Trojans? State Trojans are essentially one way of introducing insecurity into people's devices. And we continue to stand for this idea that the state should not be hacking people's devices. And I continue to hope that we can actually implement this. Secondly, maybe bit difficult, not very catchy to shout at a demonstration, which is because it's quite lawyery. And there's this judicial term about how something is highly personal, but we're saying that this is not just about privacy, but it's about the most intimate sphere. So this is a German legal term. And I personally think that this very personal, this intimate sphere was barely discussed. So this is not just privacy. This is really absolutely protected, regardless of what you suspect someone of and what you're accusing someone of. This is something in German law that you cannot interfere with. And I think this is not discussed enough. So all of this is getting more and more difficult in terms of shouting these things. So you need to find alternatives that actually protect people's basic rights. There are alternatives, obviously, but people are not even talking about these anymore. And whenever an expert tries to bring these things up as alternatives to actually hacking someone's device, people are basically barely listened to. Nobody really listens to them. And then lastly, the thing I think that's really depressing is that there are so many lawyers, and there are so many lawyers who are invited as experts. And one important thing is, the one question is also, how can you implement the measures you have in a way that's legal rather than just including technical alternatives? And then one thing we also want to get away from is this feeling-based and fields-based security policy. If there is no evidence that this actually provides further security and safety, then we're not going to implement it, full stop. And that's also really what's being said right now. And if you feel that something is going to make you safer, then we also can't do anything about that, and you shouldn't be implementing that unless you have these empirics. Good security policies are not just repressive. I think this is also very important this is not just the question of security politics is not just about what you write into a police law, right? If there are things that are insecure, there are many different ways. There are many different ways of making things more secure. So not every social problem has a technical solution, but you need to go into very different areas to find these solutions. And then we have this demand that I think that we don't need to justify in many great ways, but we shouldn't have surveillance without justifications. Even in a technical world, this is not something that should have a future, such as biometric data, other location data, movement data. These are not things that you should simply record. And lastly, we really want to know how much this costs. Everything. Do you remember what this was previously? Oh, I see very few hands. Oh well, we need to do that very quickly. The total surveillance bill is something that was mentioned in one constitutional court decision, which basically said, the question is how many different kinds of surveillance can be done simultaneously. And this is something you can use to counter this argument that it is actually possible to go dark. So basically, it is looking at how many parts of everyone's lives are already being surveilled in different ways. And in general, this whole idea of having these endangerers is something that we really need to get away from, this whole logic and this whole notion. And we just shouldn't tolerate this anymore, this idea of having preventive laws and measures. So this entire idea that has been implemented for a while and that has been manifesting itself for quite a while now. And endangerer is a term that's gotten quite popular and that's being discussed and used a lot. And so it's basically based on this idea that there are people who are intrinsically dangerous. That's completely counter to the rule of law. You can't assume that some person is by nature dangerous, because then, of course, if you think that, then you're gonna get to the conclusion that you have to put this person behind bars into custody for all of eternity. And that's something that we really need to counter. And I think important things like the indivisible demonstrations, stuff like that, we can't let people segregate us, but for every single measure, we also need to imagine that we could be affected by that and not just these endangerers.
Also ehe uns jetzt Mirko von der Bühne schmeißt, die Kriegswaffen wollen wir...
So before we're being thrown off stage, so we're also just going to briefly mention Brandenburg because they included explosives in their draft. So they are supposed to be used very carefully, such as hand grenades. So of course you're not supposed to kill anyone or prevent them from fleeing with these weapons. But if it should happen, then the exceptions are kids and pregnant people and throwing explosives into groups of people. And then I'm really like, where did they take a wrong turn? They really can't, they can't use these war weapons, right, for police. So, well, thanks so much for your attention. And just so Twitter doesn't explode after this with comments like, oh, my scooter was stolen. There was an illegal wild scooter park on this site here. So all of that was moved to this site where the legal parking area is. So now please another round of loud applause for this nice talk. Thanks from us as well. As always, please, you can give us feedback on Twitter at